Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my report on the Sports Expertise Workshop held on June 15th in conjunction with the NASPA conference in Montreal. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. A few weeks ago, I was in Montreal, Canada, for the annual meeting of the North American Society for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity, or NASPA. While I was there, I participated in a fantastic pre-conference workshop organized by Nikki Hodges from UBC and Joe Baker from York University. The workshop was called Seeing the Forest and the Trees: Theoretical and Practical Issues in Sports Expertise. It was a very fun day with a lot of interesting discussion, so I thought I would tell you about some of the highlights. The meeting was held at the very top of the tower at the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, which was built in 1976. See the show notes for a few pictures. There were a total of 15 presentations given, along with a keynote address by Jocelyn Faubert, inventor of NeuroTracker training, which I've talked about a few times on the podcast. A lot of the presentations build nicely on some of the topics I've already discussed. For example, deliberate practice. In a really interesting presentation, Edward Coolin from Cork Institute of Technology talked about some work he's been doing examining kicking skills with Gaelic football players. In their study, it was found that expert players spent more time in practice working on kicking skills that they were weaker at. For example, kicking the ball out of their hands, while novices worked more on skills that were already their strengths. Experts also showed more improvement after training and better retention of skills. Finally, the experts rated practice as less enjoyable and more effortful. So in a nutshell, the experts seem to be engaging in more deliberate practice, that is, practice specifically designed to improve performance. Interestingly, in a follow-up study, this group found that the behavior of intermediates could be changed by encouraging them to go through more self-regulation and reflection during and between practices. This presentation was followed up nicely by a related one given by Lindsay McCardle from the University of Ottawa, who talked about the link between self-regulated learning and deliberate practice. She showed evidence consistent with the Gaelic football work that experts engage in more self-regulated learning and at a much more sophisticated level, involving developing one's own goals, planning workouts, and participating heavily in monitoring and evaluation of goals. These two presentations led to a couple of interesting discussion points in the question session. First, how does a coach achieve balance between, on the one hand, keeping things fun and engaging, and on the other hand, making them challenging and effortful to follow the principles of deliberate practice? A couple different ideas were put forth. One was just having different goals for different practice sessions. For example, setting aside sessions that are just meant to be fun and let the players let off some steam. The other one was to use a constraints-led approach, where a game-like environment is used to create challenging situations. There was also a really interesting point raised by Mark Williams, which I plan to follow up in a future episode. Should we really be putting effort into training away the weaknesses of athletes? Or should we spend the time trying to change the skills that are their strengths into super strengths? Arguments were also put forth on both sides. For example, there were some great players with obvious weaknesses. For example, Diego Maradona could not use his right foot. But it was also argued that with modern analytics, it may no longer be possible to get away with having such a glaring weakness in sports. Next, Dave Mann from Vrije University in the Netherlands gave a really interesting presentation on the relative age effect in soccer, which I discussed back in episode 17. This work was inspired by analysis of one of the big clubs in the Netherlands called PSV. This club, which is notorious for being quite poor at developing their own players, were found to have a massive relative age effect, with nearly 50% of their players on the team being born in the first 3 months of the year. This outcome is consistent with what is called the maturation selection hypothesis, where scouts basically select players that are more mature instead of ones that have more potential to develop. As Dave correctly pointed out in his talk, Although there is a lot of work showing evidence of relative age effects, there is not a lot of discussion about how to avoid them. One common suggestion that has been put forth is to increase the awareness of it in scouts. And this is what Dave and his colleagues examined in an ingenious experiment. In this study, 25 scouts were asked to watch videos of youth players and rank order them in terms of their potential for becoming professional players. There were 3 groups of scouts. One group was given no information about the players, so they'll only judge based on what they saw in the video. A second group of scouts was given a sheet of paper with the players' birth dates, and finally, a third group of scouts was told that the players' jersey numbers corresponded with their age. So the player wearing number 1 was oldest, while the player wearing number 8 was youngest. So the idea here is you're giving them some awareness of how old the different players are. What was found? For both the first 2 groups of scouts, there was a clear relative age effect, with older players getting higher ratings of potential. But for the scouts that were told about the numbering system, there was no effect of age. I think this is a really interesting manipulation that could be explored more in the future. As I mentioned, the keynote presentation was given by Jocelyn Faubert from the University of Montreal. It was very interesting to hear how Jocelyn's work has evolved from a laboratory test of multiple object tracking to an applied training tool, NeuroTracker, which is now being used all over the world. Jocelyn also did an excellent job explaining the logic behind NeuroTracker. Fundamental to this is his belief that great athletes possess skill in tracking dynamic, rapidly moving objects that can be isolated and trained out of context. He presented some work consistent with this, showing evidence that the skilled athletes he has tested consistently learn the NeuroTracker test better than lesser skilled athletes, and by showing some work done with the Orlando Magic in which preseason NeuroTracker scores were predictive of on-court basketball performance during the season. He also explained the importance of the test being in 3D. It allows the performer to follow the objects in depth, which greatly improves performance. He also talked about how performance on the test can be dramatically affected by having the person stand up or do an aerobic activity at the same time. He then talked about the work looking at transfer of NeuroTracker training to real sports performance, focusing mainly on the study I talked about back in episode 21C. Although he recognized the limitations and noted we need more transfer studies, he of course wasn't nearly as critical of the study as I was. I should also mention there were also a presentation earlier in the day by Kim Dorsch from the University of Regina showing improved performance following NeuroTracker training in ice hockey referees. Finally, Jocelyn talked about some really interesting future work in which EEG is being combined with NeuroTracker so that the test will change when the user's alpha brain activity indicates that they're losing focus. He is also planning to make more sport-specific tests in the future. Of course, as I've discussed in detail throughout the podcast, not everyone is totally on board with Jocelyn's idea that you can isolate perceptual and cognitive skills, take them out of context, and train them with the result being positive transfer. The counter viewpoint was summed up well in a presentation given in the afternoon by Mark Williams from Brunel University. Mark systematically went through the evidence showing a lack of support for generalized perceptual training, and evidence consistently supporting sport-specific training. He also questioned the face validity of NeuroTracker for sports like soccer. In NeuroTracker, the motion of objects people are trying to follow is completely random, while in real sports like soccer, where there's a lot of movement going on, it is not random at all. And in fact, it is the pattern of motion that tells a player what is going on. For example, the type of defense that is being played. Mark also raised another interesting point in his talk when he looked at the issue of specialization versus diversification in young athletes. He argued that the findings supporting diversification may just reflect the culture of the countries being studied. For example, the countries for which diversification has been shown to be beneficial, like in North America and Australia, do not have a single dominant sport, while those that have found support for specialization, like most of Europe, do have a dominant sport, soccer in most cases. The final talks I wanted to mention were those given by Ricarda Stern and Ruin Canal-Bruland. Both of them touched on the issue of how athletes use contextual information to anticipate the actions of their opponents. As I discussed way back in episode 4, These are things like the count in baseball and the score in tennis or the position of your opponent. Both Ricarda and Ruin did an excellent job highlighting that we still do not know how much athletes use these information sources, as the vast majority of the work that has been done has focused on kinematic cues from the athlete's body language. Ricarda presented a very interesting way to classify the different types of information sources, and both she and Ruin talked about possible ways to understand the integration of context with other sources that occur after the action begins to unfold. This topic was discussed further once the conference began in a symposium organized by Dave Mann and Ruin that I will tell you about another time. The day ended with a very nice surprise for me. Nikki presented me with the award for the best pre-conference workshop podcast. I was also mobbed by several fans of the podcast during the course of the day. Okay, it was 3 people, but I'm grateful someone is out there listening. All in all, a great day. Thanks again to Nikki and Joe for organizing such a great event. Okay, time to end this edition of the award-winning Perception and Action podcast. Coming soon, an introduction to Bayes' theorem and how it can help you win in fantasy football. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
They said Jesus came, gone through St. Louis.